Thanks everybody for taking time out of your afternoon to come and hear what I have to say about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I will focus today on really two types of things. I will focus on why this is happening and where we'll likely go. Because I think that's one of the biggest questions people have. We've been 2 weeks into the invasion. Where is this likely to go in terms of outcomes, in terms of spreading, in terms of what it means for U.S. interests, those kinds of things. And I'll try to keep my comments relatively short so we can have time to ask questions. Warning, some maps. First technical snag. There we go. Okay, sorry for that delay. So, what has happened so far? Where are we? So this is a very uh, high vantage point view on where we are. As you all know, Russia invaded 24th of February, invades Ukraine. It's a very large-scale invasion. So Russia invades from the east, it invades from the north, and it invades from the south. So the only vantage point where Ukraine is not invaded, because it's got kind of Western allies on the west, is from the west. And it's a large-scale invasion. You've got over 190,000 troops that the Russians commit to this, thousands of vehicles. We're estimating it's over 10,000 vehicles, lots of aircraft, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, and ships as well. So we're talking about a major commitment of Russian military arms in order to try to capture Ukraine. And one of the things that we're convinced of, as of now, that this was not meant to be kind of a punishment for Ukraine or limited objectives in Ukraine. This invasion was meant to take over Ukraine. So we can see that clear as every day goes on because of the commitment the Russians have made in terms of reserves, in terms of things that they're sending to the front, and also statements that Vladimir Putin has made about what the objectives are. To give you guys a little bit of regional context, I know you guys know where Ukraine is generally, but it's useful to look at a map here. So, as I said, Ukraine has been invaded from the south. So, Crimea down there, which is part of Ukraine, it's internationally recognized as Ukraine, but Russia has occupied it since 2014. So you've had Russian forces move up from the Crimean Peninsula, also from sea. You've also had Russia, which is giant compared to Ukraine, it's pretty obvious from this map, move from the east, like I said, and then also through Belarus. And it's telling on that map, Belarus is really the strongest and almost the only ally really that Russia has of the countries that are represented on that map. So Belarus allowed its territory to be used as a jump-off point to attack from the north. And that's important as we're going to get into this because it's the easiest way to get to Kyiv, the capital, which is just a little ways south of the Belarusian border. Okay? So important thing to note about this map too is that west of Ukraine, all of that is what we call the West. Even though this is Eastern Europe now, we collectively call this the West. Why do we call it the West? Because these countries have aligned with the United States, they've aligned with Western Europe, they become part of NATO, they join the EU, they view themselves as Western in their orientation. And this is going to be a big part of the story in a few minutes when we talk about Russian motivations to invade Ukraine. So a little bit about the Ukrainian context. I think it's important for you guys to understand that Russia didn't first invade Ukraine in February of 2022. Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014. And Russia has been fighting a war in Ukraine since then. So this is really the secondary but much bigger invasion of Ukraine, the one we're talking about today. So this map gives you a little bit of a context as to why Russia first invaded in 2014. So Vladimir Putin, since he became leader of Russia, has been very adamant that Russians who are outside of Russia need to be protected. And he has made an argument that Russian-speaking individuals in Ukraine have been threatened, they've been harassed, they've even been killed, he argues. He goes so far as to say that there's been a genocide of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, which is categorically false. There's absolutely no evidence of that at all. That is what we call disinformation. He's making it up to give a pretext for intervening in Ukraine. So why do I show this map? I show this map because on the eastern side of Ukraine, in Luhansk and Donetsk, what we call the Donbas region, that's majority Russian speaking. So most of the people who live there speak Russian as their first language. Once you get west of that, then Ukrainian becomes the predominant language. Now, one really important thing for you guys to keep in mind. Just because you're a Russian-speaking Ukrainian doesn't mean that you identify with Russia. And in fact, one of the things that we've seen in public opinion data is that many of the Russian-speaking Ukrainians view themselves as Ukrainians, even though Russian may be their first language. Okay? So don't get the impression, just because Russian disinformation may be saying this, that the people in Luhansk and Donetsk are actively calling for Russia to come liberate them. Prior to 2014, that wasn't the case at all. And if you have any questions as to why Russia picked 2014 to invade, we can get into that later, but I want to focus on 2022 right now. So here's a map. It's dated. It's about a week old. I picked this map because it's relatively easy to see what's going on. And to be honest, since a week ago, you haven't seen marked changes in the battlefield, okay? Which is something that we're going to get into in a minute. The Russians have not made significant progress since a week ago. But this just shows you some progress that they've made. So they've made some progress in the north. You guys have probably seen on TV that they're very close to Kyiv. They don't completely surround Kyiv yet, but they're getting there, and we figure that maybe within a week or two, they will completely surround Kyiv. Best military estimates now are that Kyiv will probably fall within a month. So where have the Russians made their most significant advances? Their most significant advances have been in the south. They've been very slow in the north relative to the south. In the south, they've been able to do better. They're still way behind the timetable. Kyiv was supposed to fall in 2 days. 2 weeks, Kyiv is still doing pretty well. They've done best in the south because that's where their best troops are. That's where the resistance has been a bit weaker. Obviously, Ukrainians are trying really hard to keep their capital from falling to the Russians. Okay? You may say, okay, who cares about this in the south? Why does that matter? It does matter, and here's why. Here's what we're really worried about. You see those arrows coming up from the south. If the Russians are successful in breaking out and really moving quickly from the south, they will cut off those Ukrainian forces that are in the east. And that's a real worry. Because once they're cut off, that means they're cut off logistically, they're cut off from other forces coming to help them out, that kind of thing. So that could be a major, major blow to the Ukrainian army. So this southern front matters. Okay, capital's not there, but it does matter. So a really important question, obviously, is why did Russia do this? And if you guys were to look at all the statements that have come out from Russian leadership, from Putin and from the various other people that are in his circle about why Russia did this, you find that there are almost as many different reasons given as times they've spoken to the press. So that the reasoning is all over the place. Ukraine's not a real country. It's always been part of Russia. Ukraine's involved in genocide against ethnic Russians. Ukraine is run by Nazis. I'm sure you guys have probably heard the president of Ukraine is actually Jewish, and his family fought against the Nazis, so that's a little ironic. Other reasons is that Ukraine is going to develop nuclear weapons and threaten Russia, which is, if you understand or know the situation in Ukraine, it's a bit ludicrous. Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons. Ukraine actually had nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union on its territory and gave them away. Ukraine's not going to develop its own nuclear weapons capability. So the first reason is security. And this is a reason that the Russians have focused on a lot. That if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, this is the thing that they brought up time and time again. If Ukraine becomes part of NATO, that means Russian security is significantly diminished. You'll have NATO right next to Russia. Well, NATO's already right next to Russia. You have the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they're on the Russian border. Does anybody think that there's going to be an invasion coming from Lithuania, Estonia, or Latvia into Russia? No. And if you look at the American disposition of forces in Europe and our force posture in Europe, it's also not going to happen that we're going to threaten Russia from anywhere in Europe. We have actually fairly relatively token forces, or as I just said, the day before we deployed a bunch of people. Now we're definitely increasing the number of forces. But guess what? In reaction to the Russian invasion. So our force posture, in other words, how we have our forces deployed, do we look like we're in an aggressive stance, or in a defensive stance, or just kind of cruising around in our vehicles, which we do a lot in Europe, to just kind of say, hey, look, we've got some armored vehicles in Europe. Not a threatening force posture. So the security argument for Ukraine is pretty weak. And most of us who study security think this is not the real reason why the Russians are doing this. Because if anything, they've made their security much worse. How can Russia argue that they're better off in a security situation now, post-invasion, than they were prior to the invasion? They've unified NATO, they've got the United States forward deployed. Everybody is much more anxious about the Europe's, even the Germans, who wouldn't spend over 2% of their GDP on defense. It was kind of a taboo to go with that, are now saying, yeah, we're going to spend over 2% of our GDP, and we're going to give lethal weapons to the Ukrainians, which they wouldn't do before either. So what I'm getting at here is the Russians have clearly made themselves less secure. They knew that was coming. This is not a surprise to them. So security seems like not probably the strongest reason why they're involved here. Let me jump to the third one, and then I'll get to the second. Putin's political calculus. So some people think that this might have to do with Putin's relative unpopularity now in Russia. So Putin goes through kind of ebbs and flows in popularity. You may say, well, he's kind of a dictator, why does he care, right? He does depend on public support to some extent. Dictators do. They don't depend solely on terror to stay in power. And he has to have people show up to elections to some degree, although more and more people aren't showing up to elections in Russia, because what's the point, right? But he wants some degree of public support. Part of it's his ego too, right? He wants to look at those polls and say, hey, people like me. And his popularity has been diminished by COVID, by the economic problems in Russia, things like that. So some people say, well, Putin's go-to strategy when his popularity is flagging is, let's go invade some other country. So for example, if you looked at Putin's popularity prior to the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then post-2014, yeah, it worked. His popularity skyrocketed because Russians bought the argument, hey, you're going to protect these ethnic Russians that are being abused by these nasty Ukrainians. Okay? So, you know, you can call it the rally around the flag effect, however you want to refer to it, it did work. The invasion of Ukraine with 190,000 troops, where you go all the way to the western border, is a very, very different thing than the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So would Putin really think that this is going to boost him politically? Maybe, but one of the things that we know is that if you're a politician and you start a war, you better pray it's a short, low-cost war. Because long wars and wars that bring home a lot of body bags hurt popularity. So I and a lot of others think this is probably not first and foremost about Putin trying to gain popularity. So what is this about? Well, you can probably guess it's the second thing. Okay? The humiliation from loss of empire and status. And the reason why I say this is because Putin has made it abundantly clear in speech after speech that he views the collapse of the Soviet Union as a major catastrophe. In fact, he argued that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. Bigger than World War II, I guess. Bigger than World War I. Okay? So he has got a real sense of grievance about not only that the Soviet Union collapsed, but that the Soviet Union has been humiliated. And humiliated by who? Humiliated by the West. So let me show you a couple of maps to make this a little clearer. So this map shows, the red line around it shows the former boundaries of the Soviet Union. And so the yellow country obviously is Russia. And then you see all these multicolored states here. Those are former Soviet states. So those are states that broke off and became independent in 1991. So really quick and simple kind of geopolitical lesson here. Central Asia, after 1991, kind of tried to balance its relationship between Russia and the West. So it really hasn't picked sides too much. It's tried to stay in between. Eastern Europe, on the other hand, save for Belarus, has gone full in for the West. So not only did the Soviet Union lose them as part of the empire, they went with what was considered the adversary or the bunch of states that were humiliating Russia. Because in Putin's view, these countries may have people in there that lean towards the West, but the West is trying to drag those countries into it. They've been fomenting revolution. They've been trying to, have information campaigns against pro-Russian forces. So he thinks the West is intentionally trying to humiliate Russia. In fact, he goes so far as to say the West is trying to destroy Russia. So this map actually gives you an idea of how it's not just the collapse of the Soviet Union that humiliates Russia right now, and Putin in particular, it's also the expansion of NATO. So those countries that are kind of dark gray and orange, those are countries that all used to be part of the Warsaw Pact or were part of the Soviet Union that are all now NATO members. So they are all now democracies that are explicitly committed to the defense of the West. But very importantly, they are liberal democracies. They are countries that say we base our political system on the model of the West, which is completely antithetical to the political system that Putin has in Russia, which is, if you're generous, you call a hybrid democracy, which means it's got aspects of democracy, but it's not really free and fair like a democracy. So elections, they're kind of for show. So this is another thing that can tell you, okay, Russia really feels like they lost the competition. So if you've been paying attention to the invasion in the news, you know that the Russian invasion has been faltering. So what are some aspects of the invasion that we would say are indicators of it faltering? As I mentioned to you guys in my comments a few minutes ago, the invasion is far behind schedule. So it was meant to be a quick blitzkrieg type invasion to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership. Zelensky would be out of power. There'd be a pro-Russian government installed, and you really wouldn't have to conquer all of Ukraine because you could simply defeat it politically and the rest of it would just collapse. That's not happening. Clearly that's not happening. You've had very stiff Ukrainian resistance. And I point out, even among some Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are resisting the Russian army. So that's important. Like I said, that identity, it's not black and white. Oh, I'm a Ukrainian speaker, I'm a Russian speaker. Clearly, Ukrainians don't agree with Putin's idea that Russia has always controlled Ukraine and Ukraine has never really been an independent country. Okay? They feel their identity very strongly. One of the really important things that we point to is low morale among Russian troops. And there's really good indications of this because you're seeing that Russians are getting captured in large numbers. They're simply giving up their equipment, like literally leaving it sometimes running. Ukrainians are finding running tanks on the road with nobody in them. I just saw a picture before I came here of some guy who walked out into his backyard and found a $20 million Russian anti-aircraft missile vehicle that was sitting in his backyard that the Russians just left there and ran away. But that also tells you something. What is an anti-aircraft vehicle doing in the middle of this guy's backyard? It tells you not only were the people who abandoned it demoralized, it also tells you the command and control of the Russian military in this invasion has been very poor. You've had lots of units where people just go off and do their own thing. They get lost, they give up, they quit. And so it's damaging morale. So heavy losses as well. So we're seeing heavy losses. Russian tankers are getting decimated. And we didn't expect that. We thought that the Ukrainians would have a very hard time tank to tank, but we're seeing the Ukrainians have actually done fairly well tank to tank. Russian aircraft have been shot down in large numbers. We expected the Russians to get air superiority very quickly because their air force is many times bigger than the Ukrainian Air Force. They've not achieved air superiority. Ukraine's Air Force is somewhere between like 30 and 40 planes, 30 and 40 fighter planes, and that the Russians haven't achieved air superiority yet is indicative more of the low quality of Russia's command and control and morale than anything else. And so the Russians are taking some heavy losses, and we can see that this is taxing the Russian invasion effort because they're bringing in forces from the outside. So they're bringing in more and more conscripts. So those are people who, you know, at the age of 18, they get told, okay, you're in the Russian army, and for a year you have to do your service. We give you very little training, we give you a weapon, we send you to the front. Okay? You can imagine those guys are like, this is not my war, I really don't want to be here. A lot of them are quitting. They're not motivated. And they're very poorly trained compared to the people we have in our military, even the Ukrainian military. We're also seeing them bring in Chechens. They're bringing in Chechens to fight. They've even gone to Syria to try to hire mercenaries, Syrian mercenaries, to come in and fight. And they're not getting many takers, so the Syrians must be getting the news that this is probably not a war they really want to get involved in. So that sounds pretty optimistic if you're hoping that Russia fails in the invasion of Ukraine. They've also suffered broadly in terms of the sanctions against them, which I'm sure you guys have seen in the media. Russia's become a pariah. It's kind of hard to imagine that Vladimir Putin's going to get invited to anything that's not involving China or Belarus or North Korea anytime soon. You know, he did the best job ever of anybody since World War II of uniting Western Europe. So NATO is much stronger now than it was. And the Russian military has proved that it's pretty weak, that it was kind of a paper tiger. And you may say, well, what does that really matter? Well, Russia can't really compel other countries to do things the way they wanted them to do, the way they used to be able to do it. They could say, hey, we're gonna intervene militarily if you don't do what we do. Well, now, when you see Russian military intervention, it's a lot less threatening than it once seemed. So here's the outlook. This is going to be a long conflict. So almost no one who studies this stuff says that Ukraine can win this convention. So in other words, that Ukraine is going to be able to throw out the Russian invaders, on a tank-to-tank or man-to-man, kind of battlefield, large unit type war. Just because of Russian numbers. Despite their bad success rate so far, Russia just has numbers that are going to overwhelm the Ukrainians eventually. That means that this is going to become almost inevitably a very costly and long insurgency. So what that means is the Ukrainians will move from big units fighting big units to ambush, guerrilla type tactics. They've already done that to a certain degree already. But once they know that they can't operate in big units because the Russians will come after them with tanks or aircraft or whatever, they'll go into an insurgency. And the thing is, this will be a very effective insurgency for a couple of reasons. One, because the Ukrainians are very motivated to fight. Two, they've got good expertise. Okay, so this is not some guy who gets pulled out of his bed, you hand him a gun and say, okay, you're an insurgent now, go fight the Russians. And three, what is perhaps the most important factor is that this insurgency will be very heavily supported from the West. The Poles are just about ready to go over themselves and fight the insurgency. So they can't wait to help the insurgents in Ukraine because guess what? The Poles are thinking the Russians could come after us next. So we're going to help the insurgency. Other NATO countries are going to help the insurgency. You're even going to have countries outside of Europe who are going to help the insurgency. So the unfortunate consequence of a long drawn-out war and an insurgency is the Russians are probably going to turn to what we call the Russian way of war. And the Russian way of war means that you don't stick to the normal rules of warfare, you target civilians. So you basically try to terrorize the other side into giving up. And we've seen this in Syria, we saw this, they tried it in Afghanistan. We've seen it to a certain degree in Ukraine before the major invasion. It's been the Russian playbook since before the Soviet Union. In fact, the czars talked about it. Terrorism, state terrorism, is a way to make gains. So the Russians have a very different idea of warfare compared to what we have in the United States or what Western European or Eastern European countries have. And so what this is going to mean, and we're starting to see this already, is that you're going to get bombardments into civilian areas. So you may have heard that a children's hospital was targeted yesterday. Okay, you may think, oh, that was a mistake. The Russians did that because it was an errant bomb or an errant artillery shell or whatever. No. If you go to see what the Russians did in Syria in terms of targeting, they targeted schools and hospitals disproportionately over military targets. Why? Terrorize the population into giving up. So unfortunately, that's what we're probably going to see more of. This is going to escalate into a more brutal war, and it potentially, I'd say it's less than 50% chance this will happen, but it's not lower than 25% chance that this could escalate beyond the borders of Ukraine. That Poland could get involved, or that the Baltic states could get involved. Why could this happen? Part of it is the Russians could say, look, you're helping out this insurgency, we're going to hold you responsible for it, so we're going to attack you. So it may not be full-scale invasion of these countries, airstrikes, something like that. And Vladimir Putin, if he's anything, he's a risk taker. And this is a guy that will not lose. He's not going to be humiliated with his tail between his legs and say, okay, we're going to leave Ukraine. Thought that was going to work, didn't work. Okay, we're done, going to leave Ukraine alone. He would rather see Ukraine burn into cinders than retreat for Ukraine. And even if that means escalating with other countries outside of Ukraine, he's willing to do it in order to win. So this is one of the things that's very, very concerning. And from my perspective, this is the most concerning thing, is what's the end game for Putin where he can get out of Ukraine, save face, stay politically viable in Russia. And I think that's a question I don't have an answer for right now. It may be a very ugly time before we get there with the answer. All right, questions?
How long does it reverse it with an attack on that trigger Article 5?
It would. So Article 5 has only been triggered one time in the past, and that was when the United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda in 2001. There's been some discussion about whether NATO would really come to the aid of a country like Poland or one of the Baltic states if they get invaded. So yeah, you've got the legal obligation to come because of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Would the countries really come to Poland's aid? I think now it's pretty clear, yeah, they would. Putin's a risk taker, though. I'm not sure it's 100. It's guaranteed he wouldn't try to attack a NATO state in a kind of constrained way. So obviously not a big, large-scale invasion, that kind of thing. Something to be punishing. One thing that we don't talk about a lot is cyber attacks. What if he launches a crippling cyber attack against Poland or one of the Baltic states? Brings their grid down or does something, releases a dam. Does that trigger Article 5? So the Russian playbook is not just what we call kinetic forces, bombs and rockets, that kind of thing. It's also cyber, but it's also very much information. That they fight what we call the information war, where they try to convince people to believe their side of things and not believe what the West is saying. They're having a miserable time of that right now, obviously. There's a lot of people in Ukraine who have phones who are showing the world, hey, this is what's going on. The Russian narrative on this, the Russian information war, is totally bogus.
For several years now, Ukraine's been trying to convince NATO and trying to convince NATO to let them in. Do you think that this situation is going to help or hurt that cause? Because on one level, obviously, NATO might not want such a full title partner. The chance of trigger Article 5 at that point is very more convenient.
I do not think that is on the table in the near future. If Ukraine survives, I hate to say that, but it's a possibility Ukraine does not survive as a sovereign state. If Ukraine does survive, I think it's pretty likely that Ukraine will remain Western-oriented, but have some degree of facto neutrality. And actually, there's some talks now that might be the best way out for Putin. Because Ukraine says, okay, we're neutral, we're not going to talk about NATO membership, that's off the table, withdraw your forces. I think for a lot of different leaders that would be enough to get them to withdraw, but for Putin right now, he's committed so much of his stature in this invasion, it's hard for me to see him saying, oh yeah, we're going to leave. And all we got is them saying neutrality.
How does China respond to this?
So China, that's a really important question, because probably part of the reason why Russia decided to do this was that they got some degree of green lighting from the Chinese. So the Chinese said, we're not going to oppose this. In fact, we may back you up, not militarily, the Chinese are not going to do that, but we may back you up economically to a degree, we'll back you up politically. So some of you have probably seen in the media that China's then saying, well, Russia needs to show strength, Ukraine's sovereignty needs to be protected. So it sounds like China maybe siding a bit with the West. If you look at the propaganda inside China, it's completely different. It's 100% repeating what Putin said. So it is 100% the Russian narrative. That's important because to the Chinese leadership, the public that matters is not outside of China, it's inside of China. And as long as they're telling their public that the West did this, the Russians are only reacting to this because the West started this. That this is self-defense. This is not expansionism. This is not imperialism. That, I think, is something we absolutely have to take into account. And for me, that's more important than what they're saying about vague terms about sovereignty.
What do you think the likelihood is he's actually seeking to reclaim all of those former Soviets?
I think that's unlikely because, as was brought up, that invokes Article 5. It gets into a really ugly war at that point. It doesn't mean he's not going to really make their lives difficult. Through cyber attacks, through trying to foment uprisings among the Russians who live there. So in a couple of the Baltic states, there's significant Russian minorities, like about 45% of the population. So, he can cause a lot of trouble. But one of the things you have to keep in mind, though, is a lot of those Russian speakers, though, in those Baltic countries, they're like, Putin for various things. They're like, I like it in the West. My standard of living is better. I like free and fair elections. I like having my human rights. All that. So, he may try to do that, but I don't know. I think he'd be much less successful in the Baltic countries. Sure.
You say Russian speakers. Is there such a thing as is there a discernible difference between ethnic Russians and then these sort of displaced Russian speakers?
So that's a good question. So are they ethnically different? Can you tell them physically that they're Russians as opposed to Estonians? To a degree, yes. But there's been a lot of intermarriage.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, it's been a lot since the 1940s. And so, determining who's a Russian and who's an Estonian or who's a Latvian and who's a Russian is very difficult. It's mostly about identity, how you self-identify. Yeah.
So, you talked earlier about how China, 2 questions ago, was promoting the Russianization of people. If this fake investment, do you see them using that as something to reach their citizens and have their citizens support states in Taiwan?
That's a great question. A lot of people in Washington are asking that same question. How does this invasion of Ukraine affect the Chinese calculus about going after Taiwan? It's early days now. We're probably pretty early in this conflict. It's hard to see how the Chinese take the lesson from this. Hey, we should go after Taiwan. Because they saw how the West reacted to the Russian invasion. And they're seeing how the Ukrainians are defending themselves. The Chinese must think the Taiwanese are going to defend themselves at least as aggressively as the Ukrainians are, and the West is going to come to Taiwan's aid like they're coming to Ukraine's aid. Taiwan in the global economy is a very important player. It's a lot more important player than Ukraine is. So if you just take it from an economic calculus, the world has a really strong incentive to keep China away from Taiwan in terms of So that's a really good question. So, yeah, what's the advantage of Russia taking over all of Ukraine for Russia? What do they gain out of it? And I think it's a great question because I think the initial calculus that Putin made was that this was going to be easy, that they were going to go in, Ukrainian resistance was going to collapse, they'd be able to decapitate the leadership, they'd be able to set up a puppet government, and then that would be that. Ukraine would look like Belarus is now. Belarus is just basically a lapdog to Russia. So that's not happening. And it's not likely that that's going to, the situation's going to change and Russia's going to have an easier time. So Russia is now in a really ugly situation where they got involved in a war where the costs are going to far exceed any gains they made from it. And I think the real question is, how costly does it get for them in terms of people lost, economic losses, morale losses, and then Putin's political stature in Russia. So from my perspective now, and like I said, it's early days, we're only 2 weeks into this, but it's hard to see how this turns around for the Russians and they can control Ukraine in a way that benefits them. They're not going to be able to.
So even if it was easy, let's say that we were like, what do they gain from having Ukraine back? Because of the land,
So what we think is Putin would say, oh, look, we took our Ukrainian brothers, who actually are Russians. They're not really Ukrainians because Ukrainian identity really doesn't exist. We brought them back into our fold. And by the way, we saved those Russian speakers from the genocide. And we removed the Nazis out of Zelensky. And this was a heroic effort. And look at all the great things they did. That didn't happen. And, you know, young Russians get access to information from the outside. You know, they have VPNs, they can get around all the ways that the Russian government tries to bombard them with disinformation. Older Russians, they still believe the propaganda. Younger Russians don't. You know, do they go to the streets in even larger numbers? Does this start to eat into Putin's older Russian support base? You'd have to think it will.
What's been the European response?
The European Union's response. So the European Union's response has been completely united, very, very pro-Ukraine, condemning the Russians, cutting the Russians out of the economic space in Europe. So there's no light between the various members of the EU on any of this, which is actually a little bit of a surprise too, because the Hungarians, they were kind of, well, their leader was kind of pro-Russia, and then all of a sudden he's in lockstep with the rest of Europe. When he has to, you know, decide which side he's on, he's going with Europe. So the EU is totally solidified on this.
We have a question from
I have a
online.
question.
Is nuclear weaponry a concern? Or can you speak to the concerns of nuclear weapons?
Is it a concern? Yes. Is it considered likely to be used? No. So when I say it's a concern, nobody who's in a position of security decision making in Washington would say we're not going to pay attention to the nuclear dimension here, because Russia's got lots of nuclear weapons. Russia's nuclear weapons doctrine is very aggressive. So they hold out the right to use nuclear weapons in a first strike. So their doctrine says if they lose on the battlefield in a significant way, they're using nuclear weapons. So that's concerning. It's always been concerning. Is it the concern ratcheted up a little bit because of this conflict? Yes. Do we think it's likely the Russians are going to use nuclear weapons? It's unlikely, but it's still something that, you know, is not in the realm of impossibility. So I don't know if I answered your question. If you want me to give a probability range, I'd say less than 5% probability that nuclear weapons will get used.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
They've taken Chernobyl. What they benefit from Chernobyl? Nothing. Yeah, who wants a big failed
Type the question.
site?
Okay.
That they actually have to maintain, because if they don't, then it's possible the radiation can leak.
So, with respect to the Russian goal of removing Zelensky from power, what specifically do you think that entails? Was it just exiling him somewhere, or executing him potentially?
I mean, I don't have insider information on this, but my logic would tell me they're going to try to kill him.
Okay.
One, because that's what they've done in the past. Political leaders who they see as potential leaders of opposition, they kill. They do it in Russia. I mean, you've seen it. But like, for example, when Russia invaded Afghanistan in 1979, paratroopers landed on the presidential palace, walked in and shot the president of Afghanistan. They just executed him. So I imagine that that's what they're planning or trying to do with Zelensky.
Can I ask a follow-up to that as well?
Sure.
Do you see any prospects of the potential Ukrainian government in exile being established if that happens?
Yeah, and I would hope that there are plans, if Kiev is about to fall, to get Zelensky out, to either take him into Western Ukraine, that would be the most logical thing, but to keep him safe, because I think he's a very important linchpin of Ukrainian resistance. He's important symbolically, but he's been a pretty adept leader. You know, the Russians try to denigrate him and say he's a comedian, and everyone around him is a comedian. They've come up with this list that all of his advisors are all ex-comedians, so you can't take these people seriously. It's not true. But, yeah, I mean, boy, if he's not a symbol of resistance worldwide, I don't know who is.
Do you think that the U.S.'s decision to pull out of the Middle East has any impact on Putin's decision to do this now?
So when you say pull out of the Middle East, are you talking about Afghanistan?
Yeah.
So that's a good question. There may be part of it that is motivating Putin's thinking. That you know, the United States looks in general, not just what happened in the summer in Afghanistan, but this general reluctance to be involved in conflicts overseas. That kind of gave him the idea, maybe I can risk this a little bit more now than I could, say, 10 years ago. So that's part of it. So I don't think that's the whole thing. I think probably a more important variable is the Chinese and them signaling to him that they are there with him. Not, like I said, not in a military fight, but we're in a competition. Competition's a nice way of saying it, with the West. The Chinese view is that we're in competition with the West. You're on the same page with us because you're competing with them too. We're not going to pull the rug out from under your feet.
What do you think the chances are of Alice Cooper?
That's a great question, and I can tell you that there's lots of people in the intelligence community who are trying to figure that out. Because that honestly is really probably the only way, at least in the medium term, short term to medium term, that you're going to be able to stop this. If somebody from the military steps in and say, okay, this was a very bad idea, it's costing us too much, it's time for you to go. So what's the likelihood of that actually happening? I would say low. And the reason why I say low is that Putin is a very paranoid guy, and he's surrounded himself with people who he knows are loyal to him, and he's got a lot of dirt on them. One of the things that Putin, when I look at characters that seem similar to Putin, I think of gangsters. And, he's got a lot of dirt on other people around him that he can use, and that makes them loyal to him. So all of those people in the military, for example, if we look at why the Russian military has done so poorly, part of it is because instead of the funds going to the military, the funds went to the generals, and they use it to buy yachts and nice houses in the south of France and stuff like that. Those guys don't want to, they don't want Putin out because that's the situation that keeps them happy.
Can I ask a follow-up question? What's the role of the Russian oligarchy in, for example, House coup or the decisions that are being made?
So it's not a dissimilar situation with the oligarchs. The oligarchs that look like they were disloyal, they got put in prison or they got silenced, exiled, whatever. The ones who are loyal to Putin, those are the ones that have been able to stay in Russia and have these positions of prominence in the country. Could they turn against Putin? Yeah. Could generals turn against Putin? Yeah. It's not impossible. Right now, I think it's unlikely. because he's done such a good job of really protecting himself from potential threats. What it's going to take is it's going to take enough of these powerful people to turn against him. If it's just one or two, it's not enough. You have to have, you know, a sufficient mass of these people to turn against him where people think, okay, it's safe for me to do it too.
So we have time for maybe one more question. Because we have to be back for another engagement at 5. So if there's one more question, and I actually have one final question.
Yeah, so as far as economic sanctions on Russian military, this will be effective, or it will affect all of the Russian leadership, and just effective.
So they're definitely effective. They're definitely hurting the Russians. I think the key question, though, is it enough to change Putin's mind, to change his direction? There, I would say no. I don't think it's enough to change him. He's very, very mission-oriented with this. And his mission is to take Ukraine and make it part of his empire, if you want to call it that. It's hard for me to see him dissuaded because of economics, because that also then shows weakness for him, and he's extremely allergic to appearing weak.
So I have one last question / comment. One of my favorite podcasts, at the end, they sit around and they drink tea, and the host asks the guests, what's the one thing that you would have liked to have said during the program that you maybe didn't get a chance to touch on, didn't get asked? So what's the one thing that you think is important that we didn't get to today?
I think one thing that I didn't talk about very much, but I think is really, really important for you guys to think about, is how this conflict is putting in even starker relief the difference between the authoritarian world and the democratic world. That I think a lot of countries have come down on one side or the other, and it's not just about economics, it's not just about ethnicity or identity, it's really about how important do you think democracy is, you know, real democracy, as opposed to authoritarianism. And so we're seeing to a certain degree the world divide up along those lines. You know, Cold War, it was communism versus, you know, capitalism or whatever you want to call it. Now it's much more, you know, are you for democracy and all the things that go with liberal democracy? Or are you pro-authoritarian? I think that'll be the defining competition in the world for some time to come.
Well, thank you. I can't tell you how great this has been. Let's give Karl. Hopefully we'll have you back, and you'll be able to tell us. You'll be able to tell us everything that happened leading up to our successful conclusion to this. But with that, again, I'd like to thank you all for coming, whether it's in person or virtually. We try to do these regularly and really bring new ideas and new discussion to our community. So again, thanks for coming, and I hope you stay safe and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.